from here on out, right? I deeply apologize. I did screw that up. I probably shouldn't be the host because I've got a lot of other things in my head, but I don't. I don't want you and Peter to always feel obligated to be here all the time. So now I feel badly enough, not only for you, but for me and for anybody else. I will not forget to do that again. I apologize.
Yeah, but I reread this chapter. I did the work, and this is a tremendous survey, and it just sickens me to miss it.
Well, we didn't get very far. If it's
we didn't get very far. If it makes you feel any better, actually.
We spent a long time talking about the sense of modernity that he discussed in the very first paragraph, and then we started in on the paragraph where he makes the distinction between representation as making present, as placing before one, and as being conscious of. And the quintessence of that at least I was trying to get across is that what we're trying to get, what sense is Schmidt using the word representation and consciousness and Vorstellen? What's the sense in which he's using these words? And the sense that I'm impressing upon everybody to use is that thought is dependent on something else to think. It is passive, it is receptive, and it requires some other faculty or some other agency to give it, to present it, to put something in front of it so that it can do its analytical activities and start taking it apart. Right? And so we have this idea of thought as representation, representing something that's already given to it, and then starting to take it apart in analytical activity. And in terms of substance, I think that's all we really got to. But that was, for me, systematically the most important point is that we kind of triangulate these German words, vergegenwärtigen, vorstellen, Repräsentation, right? That these, and consciousness is the fourth word, as all being, and we think of them in terms of their dependence on something else so that thought has something to think.
Now, we've gone into the William of Ockham model and none of that, because isn't that where the representational thinking comes, since perception does all this magic work of handing the intellect something?
Yes, but he talks about it briefly in the foreword. We didn't get past the foreword. And so I was just, so I'm taking the passages and reading closely the ones where he talks about the difference between representation and distinction. And we began to talk about representation, but we never had a chance to talk about distinction yet.
Oh, I'd really like to talk about representation. I mean, is that akin to something like a model, like the way we always talk about models, statistical models, for example, stuff like that? Is a model a good analogy for representation?
Yeah, I think that's excellent, because a model is always something, a model of something else. And so it's dependent on this other thing for it to even be a model, like an image, right? Or like the Platonic critique of images, that they tend to substitute themselves for what their image is of, and therefore become very deceptive in knowledge.
And actually, this is a good segue to
Thank you, Rich.
What I wanted to bring up. So maybe as Schmidt would think, to kind of use the tools of the enemy, like this thought as representation. So this would encompass, semiotics, or what Lacan would call the signifying chain or the symbolic register. Mm-hmm. Okay. I mean, he's not going to go into that. Okay, but I just wanted to make sure that we're mapping on to the kind of the same ballpark of things, I guess.
Right. Yeah. No, that's good, because those sciences, take representation and completely, I mean, from de Saussure on, right, completely separate them from all question of reference. And so there is no, these French linguistic sciences, right, there is no real that all these linguistic marks and stuff are modeling or something like that. So you can say, well, they're anti-representational, yes, but they're no longer, they don't really, there's no, there's no anchor to the world in these semiotic systems. So they pose a different set of problems than the one Schmidt's interested in, which is the set of issues that drips down into like everyday life, where we're all taught, you know, and you need what science is and what knowledge is about those things out there, right? And then we get all our panties in a whatever it's called, you know, we get all excited about, well, is there an external world? And if there's no external world, then there's no knowledge, and we get into these Cartesian problems. And Schmidt wants, so that's an artifact of a particular way of thinking, and in fact, a very inadequate way of thinking about thought and what thought thinks, what its object of thought is. Okay, yeah. So thanks, Richard. Let me say, I got a couple of hands, and then and then Bo, I know, has we'll probably have some more remarks about these opening chapters. So I'd love to hear them if you feel like sharing them. But we got Brian and Greg.
Yeah. So this is Brian. I want to build on what Tyler was saying about feeling, and kind of pose a question, and look at Schmidt's background a little bit more. I think it's very important to understand where a philosopher writer is coming from, and where he's not coming from. And it seems like he's proposing a dichotomy between an epistemological dichotomy here. And I think that's really unusual for a modern writer. I mean, feeling is such a big topic now, and the effect of modern scientific life on feeling and on experience. And we start hearing about that in Marx, and then we have the existentialists. So we realize from those writers that it's a visceral experience of life that modernity is creating, that the divide is creating of labor working 8 hours, 10 hours, 12 hours a day, moving an object from one place to another. It diminishes the overall human being. I mean, these existentialists established these ideas and wrote about them, and yet Schmidt, is he sidestepping the existential history that came before him completely, and just taking, let's just say this is an epistemological problem? I find that really surprising for a philosopher to do.
Yeah, well, that's what he's doing. He's completely and utterly focused on epistemological issues, right? Because, right. Well, I mean, there's a lot of reasons, but no, your assessment's correct. He doesn't care very much about what the existentialists say, and and just like he's very critical of the validity claims of most modern thinkers, because he thinks that they're always thinking knowledge in terms of knowledge is always knowledge of something given to thought, and thereby the problem of skepticism arises, and then the problem of we can never know if we ever know arises, and now we begin the arbitrary. Since we never know whether we know or not, right? That we're just going to start with human action, or we're going to start with the revolution, or we're going to start with the will to power. We're just going to take an arbitrary starting point. This is modernity. This whole arbitrary starting point, and then using the rhetorical means of Karl Marx or Nietzsche or Jean-Paul Sartre to make these kind of arbitrary starting points appetizing to a new generation. So the whole cultural, the set of cultural practices, I think, is highly distasteful to Schmidt, because it's so blind to what the Greeks have already overcome. But since we don't know how to read them, we are ignorant of that, and so we think that these arbitrary starting points are really the only thing left available to us. So that's my defense of Schmidt, that his ambit is constrained by epistemological concern, and that's how he's going to construct his historical narrative, only on those epistemological pillars. So, if we
Thank you. Yeah,
we can
that's-
criticize him as a cultural historian, but he's not trying to be a cultural historian. He's trying to show that there's this interrelation between cultural history and epistemology.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Brian. Greg.
I sort of want to preface this with I'm also concerned about his attitude towards science, and you reminded us that he wants to keep the best of both worlds. But actually, in his defense, when it comes to cognition and how tight the relationship is between reason and feeling, whatever modern neurology's results are, our brains function just like ancient Greek brains. And so there's something at a higher level, at a cultural level, that he's concerned with. And so whether feeling and cognition are inseparable, they were inseparable back then, if they're inseparable now, neurologically speaking.
And they
so
were
that might not make any difference.
No, that's great. That's awesome. But they're also inseparable during the whole heyday of early modern dualism, when they were considered to be, two different systems that each had its own autonomy in the human system, and that there was also some kind of ghost in the machine that was always switching back and forth from the one to the other. Right? Very, very inadequate model, but it was the best the early moderns had. But no, I like the point. That the brain has basically been the same for at least 3,000 years, and therefore that unity too is always posed for us to think. And that's another thing about Schmidt. He's really good at, I think, getting us to ask the question, not only is this thing, the cup, the room, the factory, is this one thing? And if it's one thing, in what sense is it one thing? So what we're going to do is we're going to discriminate between senses of one, or senses of unity, which is itself is a deepening of our understanding of the way in which things hang together, as it were. So I think it's a really great byproduct of this work is it gets you to focus on that question that seems very remote from everyday concerns, and indeed it is. But once you start recognizing that there's different ways that things are one, and that things manifest these different kinds of unities, it's impossible to just kind of treat them all as if they were just different rearrangements of atoms or something. Anyway, Clark, thanks for your patience.
Yeah, so it's a little bit different the way I'm viewing this, and I just wanted to point it out again. The way in which feelings are inseparable from thoughts, according to modern neuroscience of the school of Paseo, is very different than what occurred in antiquity. And here's how it's different. We now know something that they did not know. That this, and this is, it's really inaccurate to talk about feelings and thoughts, because what is happening in neuroscience is that there's many, many layers of distinctions on types of feelings we give no words to. But we now know, and Robert Burton, another great book if you're interested, on being certain, his book on being certain, Robert Burton, he's the one that first pointed this out that I'm aware of, that sensations are critical parts of us having a sense that we're even thinking. And what those thoughts are also dependent on sensations. We don't even have awareness of them unless we really study it and we start to, stare at our navel and really become aware of it. This is a completely different understanding. It's not about the old thing of feelings and thoughts. This is about something is in the mix of feelings that are outside our control that directly give us the confidence that we think we know what we're thinking.
Mm.
That is what modern neuroscience at the cutting edge of cognition and emotions is discovering. And I cannot leave that distinction out or try to conflate it with what the experience of the Greeks had or anybody else. We're still living with the old, I mean, in popular culture, with a misunderstanding of how feelings and thoughts are. We think we can separate them. We think we know what is a thought and what is a feeling, and we're finding that that is just very inaccurate. And this can be shown, you know, why do you walk into a movie theater, all of us together, and we see the same movie? We all walk out with different feelings and thoughts. We have the same stimulus. We have completely different, I mean, that's a very
Clark, later in the
talking about it.
Later in the book, it's very clear. Smith makes it crystal clear that feelings indeed include thought and vice versa. He makes it very clear.
But not at the level at which modern neuroscience is talking about feelings, which is in terms of sensations, of actually making thought possible.
This is very funny you're bringing this up. We've had this reaction when we started this book before. People pulling out their science textbooks and going on this. I'm not really interested. I'm not here to talk about modern neuroscience, okay?
Wait,
well,
but it's
how
still,
can we have an intelligible conversation about what thinking consists of, especially if it's thinking as being or thinking in terms of thinking itself,
right?
If we cannot consider this, and that's against Aristotle's whole presentation. He begins with experience. He begins with experience, and then he leaves, goes from there.
Peter, you go ahead and hop in. You've had your hand up.
Yeah, so I was just going to respond to Clark. Suppose we I can just grant you that the neuroscience relationship between, say, sensations and thinking and feelings and all that sort of stuff. Just grant that. The question is, what is the content of our thought? I mean, in terms of thought itself. I mean, that's what we're really caring about. I don't care if it's, because thought has its own sort of logic to it and its own sort of relationships and its own necessity that it does, it's like who cares if it's, when we're thinking about emotions, thinking about something, then maybe that's interesting from the neuroscientific, but from the philosophical point of view, Aristotle's thought about, what are causes or what is substance, that has nothing. I mean, if he had to have certain sensations in order to have those thoughts, okay, that's nice, or not, who cares? It's the thought that counts, really.
I like that point. It's the thought that counts, and that's the interesting thing. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, but that goes to the idea that this is about distinctions or discriminations, as Schmidt is talking about. Right. He's saying, these things don't matter because we're just discriminating. What I'm trying to say is the very act of you thinking that you're discriminating is no different than if I was on an LSD trip and I was having incredible thoughts. Now, if I wrote them down, they all felt perfect. Of course, the next day I read my gibberish, But but the point here is in science number 2, it's about the sociality, our social relationships that make sense of this, that allows us to protect ourselves from ourselves. And if we think we don't need that protection, that we can sit, on the mountaintop by ourselves and contemplate the truth, then I think there's a huge gulf in how we're going to even think about together what feelings and thoughts and sensations and the whole thing is.
Well,
I don't think you can just discount it. I don't think you can discount it at all.
So I think one important thing to consider here is that, so we want to say that one of the alternatives is to think that something makes thought possible. And then we say that's sensation, right? Part of the problem there is when we're distinguishing thought from sensation, we're doing it in thinking, not in sensations.
That's not what modern science shows. They hook you up. They can actually tell you that there's no distinction that you're just making between thinking and a feeling or a sensation. So that, in other words,
they hook you up with the instruments. that measure what they think matters. They're instruments that have all sorts of assumptions in them, and what the phenomenon they think they're measuring. There's so much loaded into that, Clark. Presenting this like
No
it's
doubt.
some kind of
Absolutely.
definitive thing.
Well,
Bullshit.
Yep.
I think
Bullshit.
one.
Well, no, but
one-
so that would be a
They build
conclusion I couldn't
instruments,
make.
that stuff they hypothesize is there. So they've created the entities in their mind.
So
No. You know that stuff can be blown to
Hey,
pieces.
can I?
When they sit there and they put monitors on brains, they're like, look, this part of the brain lights up. And that's that sector. Really?
something
Well,
something
let-
important there.
Well,
though.
can I just say that this is the free-for-all, so at least in this hour, neuroscience is fair game. So
Can I make one
Yeah.
point before Greg goes?
yeah. So we got two. So we got two people. So first, Greg, and then Tyler.
Oh, so I wanted to
I'm
ask
actually
if
glad you
y'all,
reminded me of that.
if y'all would agree to this statement that there's no gulf between feeling and reason.
So yeah, that's what I was gonna talk about, because if there's no gulf, then sensation, right, cannot be what makes thought possible because it is thought.
Right.
If there's no gulf.
And
So we can't have it both ways.
No, that's nicely put.
Okay. Well, yeah, could I just offer a
Oh,
counterpoint
sure.
to that? I see a gulf between feeling and reason. Not in that they are separate, but how the feelings give feedback to whether a distinction is noticed in awareness.
Right. Yeah.
So I think, that doesn't answer things to me. I think this is why rationality doesn't stick in the same way with every person. This is why some people don't take vaccines. It doesn't stick in the same way because the distinction is based on feelings outside their control. They're unconscious. They can be affected by how you think. So it's a big complex mess.
I can't tell you how
Having
nauseating.
No,
I
and
can't tell you
feeling
how
in multiple
nauseated I am for
senses
everything you
now.
just said, Clark. But I do want to apologize for something. This is free for all. So this is the exact right time. No, it is. And it's because I missed the first hour. If this happened in the first hour, I don't want to talk about it. But right now, it's the exact. No, I mean it. It's the right time to do it. So I'm sorry.
Clark was admirably restrained in the first hour, and it's only in the free for all that we started.
Yeah.
That's how it
If this
should be.
were
And that's the way it should
seminar-
be. So Clark did it utterly right. So, so
if this were a seminar on badminton, what would one of the pro neurologist people say differently?
Oh, I'm not following that. Sorry.
Oh, I mean, the neurological stuff is true and applicable no matter what to go back to Peter's thing, the content of the thought. If this were a group who came to discuss badminton on Thursdays and someone really knowledgeable of contemporary science wanted to bring up how the hand-eye coordination works and stuff, I don't think I would hear much different. And also if this were a seminar on, well, I don't know, it's a seminar on philosophy, and it's odd to hear the
Spelunking.
neurological
Because,
things that would be the same in a seminar on badminton, even though they're all.
Because the analogy between badminton and saying that thinking thinks itself are two different, they're not analogous. We're actually talking about ontology and being.
Yeah.
We're making a case for something existing. His thesis is there's two different types of rationality.
Right.
And so I want to make sense of, are there two? So that's not badminton. That's something that's a deeper, more complex, claim.
Yeah, but I just I see hands. Never mind. I'll say it afterwards. The short version is we're often dealing with equivocation here when we speak about sensation in relationship to a specific concept of thought, and the neuroscientist talks about sensation with respect to a completely different concept of thought. Right? We're using the same words, but we're talking about different things, and so it's really hard to. It's hard for the two disciplines to make contact, but I think they can, but it takes a lot of work. And so I appreciate this. Sorry, I was going to keep that short. Never mind. Philip, go ahead. It's good to see you're here.
Yeah, I don't mind talking about neurology in this context, but I'd resist the idea that neurology can count as some sort of rock bottom explanatory level, or that neurology has the right to set itself up as the judge of other disciplines. I mean, and I should mention, I'm deeply committed to science, if you consider mathematics a science, which you may or may not. So the thing is, right, if you look at neurology literature, it comes in the form of statistical analyses, right? So statistics could set itself up as the judge of neurology, and frequently does, and frequently finds massive statistical flaws in neurology research. You know, that's fine. That's how science works. You find a problem, you go back, you correct it. Now, logic can set itself up as the judge of statistics. It frequently does. Okay, so now who judges logic? Well, you know, basically everybody, has been my experience. So I'm just saying, I don't like the idea of neurology being allowed to function as some sort of rock bottom, the buck stops here. You know, if it doesn't meet the test of neurology, we got to throw it out, because neurology is basically all statistics at this point. It lives or dies based on its statistical merits, and often there are major problems in the statistics that it's using.
Yeah, no question. No question.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So thank you. I mean, that's it. That just adds to the ambiguity. And I think that there's something that Philip said that has a very productive ambiguity when he said, who judges logic? Well, everybody. But in a sense, that's true and that's not true, because it's not every Joe Schmo who goes and makes up their own logic, right? But rather, logic does have this ground level thing insofar as nothing can be true that violates it. And that is true for everybody. And so logic is this, and that's exactly where we're going with the whole question of discrimination, right? Logic is the self-articulation of thought, of everybody's thought, of thought as thought. And that gives it this, both the universal character. Anyone who thinks will, if they want to think validly, if they want to think with respect to truth, cannot violate logic. But thinking logic is thinking certain contents, and those contents are semantically related to other contents. And then we can start to explore, so to speak, the inner side of logic, which is precisely metaphysics. So logic is, so statistics can't violate logic, neurology can't violate it. None of these would be sciences if they did. And logic can't violate logic. But that means that logic is the only science that has this self-relationship. It is self-determining. And to understand that is to understand why logic and metaphysics go hand in hand. And that's what we want to explore. But yeah, okay. So I just want to say that I like these thoughts, because it frees me a little bit to point to what I think is most exciting about Aristotle and Schmidt and stuff like that, is precisely this strange thing that is more us than we ourselves, and that is logic. And that's universal, and it's pervasive, and nothing can violate it that can hope to be true.
I'd like to differ with that statement. I hope I'm not the only one to differ with ideas that logic is universal. I mean, logic it has a realm of applicability, and there's a world of experience outside of that realm. Logic is derived from language, basically, and logic is the logic of our language, and language is the way we perceive and talk about the world to each other. But there are vast realms of experience that just cannot be spoken about with logic, and that's why we have poets, because logic isn't adequate. So yeah, logic has a domain of applicability, which is science and math and philosophy.
No, I appreciate your point. Actually, maybe somebody's going to pursue that, but I just want to say, and I respect the reference to poets, but unless you start messing around with your understanding of what truth is, and you start making truth personal and private, in other words, something that can't be true at all, okay? Then we don't look to poets for objective truth. But if you want objective truth, You can only do it by not violating the framework of logic. And so that's the only thing I'm really super interested in to get people a little focused on. Yes, there's poets. Yes, there's lots of stuff that
I'm going to challenge you one more time.
We don't
Mike.
want to think clearly about, but just this weird thing that we can orient ourselves towards truth. And the first step and the most important step to that is to find out what the laws of logic are, because as Wittgenstein says, the limits of logic are the limits of the world. And that's
he said that in the Tractatus, not in the philosophical investigation. So let's be clear about that.
Yeah, but that's fine.
I want to challenge you on one more point, Michael. Okay, you're right about the poets being a subjective truth, but I think truth is an equation. It's a social construct. It's a linguistic construct. It has a domain. We agree that 4 + 4 equals 8. That's in the domain of math. We agree that if all men have 2 legs, that's not a good syllogism. But anyway, the point I want to make about logic is that it has a realm of functionality and a domain of functionality. And that's because truth has a domain of functionality, and it's a social construct. And who's to say that personal experience is any different from, any better, or any worse, or any different from communal experience, which is what establishes language. So, and the truth and the logic of language. So it's something to think about.
No, I appreciate that. I appreciate that. I deeply think it's very wrong, but what I want, but I don't want to be the person to deliver that necessarily. I just want the text to work whatever, to deliver whatever content it can, so that you maybe think that, because what's going on here is you're coming in and saying, well, truth is a construct. Well, is it? Right? Is it? What makes it a construct? And so you've got very specific theories about truth and stuff like that. And what I want to do is I want to just knock all that stuff away and say, whatever truth is, right? It's only that which is objective is true, and so on. And logic has something to do with that. And if we want to think truly about experience, we can't contradict ourselves, period. And if we want to think truly about anything, we can't contradict ourselves, period. We can say lots of things, and they don't have to be true. They can be communicative or whatever, right? But if we want them to be true, we can't contradict themselves. And just thinking about this constraint is actually enough to get the whole logic, metaphysics, being and thought thing going. And that's what I want to explore. And if other people have just are going to define truth and stuff like that just differently for whatever contingent reasons, we just need to mark that now we're changing the subject and we're talking about something else.
Yeah, I agree. And I agree that, for the topic for the purpose of a discussion, like a book,
right?
Truth and logic apply, and what they really depend on, and we discovered that in the first hour, is what the definitions of the terms are.
Right.
And we all kind of come to to an agreement on what these definitions are. And then we can start having a logical metaphysical discourse about
cool. Yeah, that's where I want to be, and that's where I want to be, because I think that's the most productive thing to actually think about that. When we start going relativist and talking about constructs, stuff like that, just it gets to be impossible for you and me or anybody to agree about anything, because we've got our own personal conception of truth and our own personal conception of experience and our own personal conception of what a construct is and what makes a construct and what makes it a good construct and a functional construct and what's a function, right? And all this stuff becomes utterly private. And I want to get it out of that private sphere and think about this. How must we think about them such that we could make true statements about them? And that's the way we ought to be talking about them, rather than keeping them kind of mired in this subjectivity. But I got a couple of hands here, and Brian
was up for a while. First was Peter's, but he's gone. I understand that Parmenides was discussed, and Tyler and I have been discussing this, but I'd like to hear
No,
how did knowledge end up getting to be passive in the representational thinking? I mean, so could you cover the Parmenides? Because I really sad that I missed that.
no, there was no discussion of Parmenides
It
today
was the
whatsoever.
identity of thought and being. That's what he's talking about.
Yes, so that's Parmenides, the identity of thought and being.
Did we say
Could I
something
jump
about
in here?
We did.
Did we say
Yeah,
something about that?
we did. So
Yep,
we-
Tyler, go ahead, refresh my memory so I can, since it's being recorded for posterity now, rehearse whatever it is that we talked about before.
Yeah, we were talking about how in discrimination, thought and being are, it's still possible for them to be one, but in representation, it's not.
All right, that was Philip's point.
Yeah, could I jump in here?
Absolutely.
There's a couple of just simple, boring facts about contemporary logic, which both support what everybody said and are in tension with what everybody said. So let me just say the facts.
Excuse me, you're now skipping the topic. I'd like my point finished before we proceed to yours.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
But this, I'm not skipping the topic. I'm taking up a discussion of logic which was made prior
And that
to your
was a
point,
prior
sir.
one, and I put my hand up, and now I'm in line. And now you're jumping ahead of me.
All right.
You're up. You can talk about that, and we can go back to that.
Philip, I really want to talk about this, Philip. So thanks for bringing it up. I'm just trying to gather my wits together, right? So Philip brought up the point, that the theological point that if being and thinking are defined as separate, then once that definition happens, it's impossible to think about thought as itself not only being anything, but containing any ontological truths just in and of itself, right? And so so we made briefly this contrast between what the Greek discovery was, which is that thought is contentful in and of itself. And in fact, once it has one content, it has all true contents. This is the, what I might call the Parmenidean Greek discovery that then became an object of research and bone of contention and turned into a real driving force in the development of pre-Stoic philosophy. Right. And so one of the points we made was if you just go ahead and just start defining being and thought as being two completely separate things, right? And that's what happens when we define thought as representation. Thought is always dependent on something else for it to have content and for it to do its work, right? Then at this point, it is impossible to even imagine what it is that the Greeks were talking about. And so what we do is we start projecting, this was like all just kind of a religious thing for them, or, they were steeped in myth and they hadn't freed themselves from myth yet. And they hadn't realized that, the things that are in your head and your little mental representations inside of you are somehow different from the representations that your senses give you. They just hadn't made those kind of distinctions. That's the early modern critique of this stuff. And so, yeah, so we briefly fleshed that out, that once you think of thought as representation, then what the Greeks did is necessarily incomprehensible. And so we have to use like anthropology and sociology and stuff like that to explain how they can have these infantile, primitive notions. So that's about as far as I remember, that's as far as we got. And that's the most justice I can do to your question, Bo.
That sounds really wonderful. I'm satisfied.
All right, cool. Thank you very much. No, I appreciate it. And Philip, thanks for your patience waiting through that.
Sure. Yeah. By the way, it sounds like you have too many Philips, so I can be Philippe. I'm Canadian. I can be Philippe.
Oh, well. Beautiful. Okay, that helps. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So first of all, just a really boring point about logic.
Right.
A few of them actually. First of all, you got to always make a distinction between pre-Frege and post-Frege, right? So before Frege, it was all Aristotelian logic or logics that were derived from Aristotle, or fringe logics like Stoic logic and whatnot that didn't really become super mainstream. Okay.
Right.
So what happened to post-Frege logic is and I should mention, like, my area of specialization was mathematical logic. So what happened is we now talk about logics, plural. And you might think this supports a relativistic point, but it doesn't. In much the same, like, basically we think of logic as you got to have the right tool for the job. Now, if I was a carpenter and I had a saw and a hammer and a screwdriver, that's not an argument for relativism. That's just an argument for you got a bunch of tools, there's a world, and let's analyze it with the right tool if you're a logician. I'll also make the point that one big growth area in logic is an area called paraconsistent logic, where you do allow limited amounts of contradiction into the system. Like if you think in standard logic, one contradiction implies all contradictions, and that's kind of crazy in its own way. So I mean, if the idea of allowing limited contradictions into a system sounds crazy, so does the opposite, right? Like your computer might crash when you have one contradiction, but I don't crash when I make one contradiction. Like somehow me as a system, I manage to just work around it. So I'll see if people want to comment on that, but I do have a question about Schmidt that I've been wanting to ask for a while. So I'll come back to the Schmidt question.
I'd like to comment. I'd like to comment on that.
I've got to say one quick thing. Paraconsistent logic traces its origins back to the ancient Greeks and the liar paradox, and people who were willing to accept that the liar paradox might simply be true. It might be a true contradiction. That is the inspiration for the word I can never say, which is dialetheism, something like that, or paraconsistent logic. Yeah.
Yeah, dialetheism. Yeah, exactly. All right, so Philip, are you going to sit on your Schmidt question for a second while we cycle through some hands, or do you want to just?
Je suis Philippe maintenant.
Yeah,
I'm Philip now.
Question. Yeah. All right. So okay. So we got some hands, and then I'm going to come back to Philip and get back to Schmidt. But this is obviously an exciting topic, so let's run through it. So we've got Clark and then Tyler.
Yeah, just to follow up on our new Philippe. Very catchy sort of. Love that. Any chance?
I feel 5% cooler now.
Yeah. No, I really like what you said. So here's my problem with logic is that it doesn't fit living systems. So if I mean, and you just described it, I think, and tell me if I'm wrong. Living systems can tolerate inconsistencies and breakdowns. They can. They fit more in that second type of logic than, to me, the first type of logic. And I need to know how there can be a connection between those two. Because the idea of creating a wonderfully logic, and I can't imagine doing logic better than what I'm learning in Aristotle. I just can't. But my problem is, how relevant is it? Because if it doesn't address living systems in a direct way, that is the defeasible sense I have of being a mortal creature in a mortal world that evolved, where substances are constantly begetting new substances. That is not a logical world that I see reflected in Aristotle. So anyway.
Cool.
Okay.
Thank you. Let's see, Tyler, and then back to Philip. Philippe.
Yeah, regards contradiction, I think one thing we can say about a contradiction is it's not going to be like a computer crash. It's simply a failure to think something. Contradictions are usually when we use a term in an ambiguous way. And so it seems like we're saying two things are the same are different in the same respect, and the same in the same respect at the same time. I just butchered that, but anyway, okay. So what happens with a contradiction is that we don't understand what we're thinking, not that it somehow destroys our system. It's an unsystematic way of thinking, but it doesn't prevent someone from thinking systematically through their contradiction, trying to clarify why they don't understand what they're saying.
Right, and I think that's an important point, right? Because there's the contradiction as it pops up in dialectic, which means we're trying to understand something, and then we find out that we're giving contradictory predicates to the same thing, and thereby proving that we don't know how to think that thing, and then thereby saying, okay, I'm going to give up, either take one arm or the other arm of the contradiction, or I'm going to go from the drawing board. But if I'm going to attain understanding, I can't do it in virtue of a contradiction, but the contradiction is the warning sign that I don't have the understanding. So in that living dialectical context of philosophical investigation, it's the motor of the conversation, and it brings thinking further, and it doesn't cause any system crashes or anything like that. So I like what Tyler's bringing up here, that in living language, a contradiction is a thorn in our side to think further and think better. But it's different when you start thinking in terms of formal mathematical systems, and then using those to program some activities of some things and something like that, right? And just in virtue of this, we recognize that we're using contradiction, and we're using logic in an equivocal manner, right? And so what holds for formal systems doesn't hold for dialectic. What obtains in dialectic can't just be projected onto formal systems, right? The one is kind of a living language and the activity of the intellect getting clear about something. And that's different than what a formal system can do or intends to do. So I just wanted to bring that out. People can disagree with it, but that's how I see it. I got Philip and then Clark.
Oh,
Okay.
Clark, unless you wanted to follow up on that, I don't know.
No. Go ahead. Yeah, Philippe.
Philippe, okay. All right, so there's something I want Schmidt to do that he's not doing yet, but it's a big book, and he might do it at some point. So he's contrasting antiquity and modernity, and he is explaining antiquity at the level of concepts, ideas, how words fit together, right? He's explaining the underlying philosophy. And that's great, but when he turns to modernity, he is also criticizing modernity at the level of concepts, ideas, words, how words fit together. And I'm very interested in that when I'm wearing my philosopher hat, right? But when I'm wearing a different hat, like a sciencey hat or something, the thing about modernity is it always has another option, which antiquity doesn't have. Modernity always has what I'm going to call like the pragmatist defense, because and it's not just when people like Schmidt do this, like when feminist epistemologists or people like Bruno Latour, science studies people criticize science, the scientists will often come back with the reply, yeah, but the airplanes stay in the air.
Right.
And it's pretty hard to argue with that. Now, I'm going to extrapolate on that, which I don't think most scientists would do. And the scientist might say, the very fact that the airplane stays in the air is evidence that I have some connection to being. It may not be a connection that I can articulate. So you, Arbogast Schmidt, just because I can't articulate this correct connection to being that I have, that doesn't mean I don't have it. And the evidence that I have it is that the airplanes stay in the air. And I'm a very mixed feelings about this. I feel the pull of this argument, but I also, it doesn't feel like enough for me. And I also want to give one more example so it's not all technological. Let's say I met a horse whisperer. I've never met one, but let's say I met a horse whisperer and I saw that they really genuinely could change the behavior of horses. I would take that as evidence that that horse whisperer had some connection to being. And if I then ask them to articulate that connection to being, they might say, oh, I have no idea how I do it. So I just want to hold out a plea for how there could be like modernity or other ways of thinking could have a connection to being that they can't articulate, and you can't utterly dismiss it just because they can't articulate it. And I would love it if Schmidt at some point addresses that, but he hasn't so far.
Interesting. Yeah, well, keep that question in the back of your head and see if he does it even indirectly, because I'm not sure, right? I'm not sure if he does or not. Okay, got a couple more hands. We got Tyler, then Clark.
Regards logic and language, I think one thing that's important is that we have to use language or words and sentences and structure and so forth in a way that makes ourselves intelligible to others according to the laws of thought, not the laws of language. So logic is primary. And a good example of that would be we can say things that look like contradictions at the level of language because they use one word that has two different senses. And someone can pick up that they have the two different senses and recognize that it's not a contradiction. And so all kinds of, I think pretty much all language, if we treat it as merely the words or the symbols, ends up being contradictory every time we say X is the same as Y in any way whatsoever. So we have to understand that what we're doing with our symbols is saying something that cannot completely be expressed through symbols without understanding them as being an expression of the laws of thought, but not equivalent to them.
Right. No, I think that's a beautiful point. And, you know, and this was near and dear to Plato's heart when he's trying to understand and think through judgment, because every time we say, you know, the crow is an animal, we're saying that two different things are not different. And I think it's Antisthenes in his school that said, you know, every judgment is a contradiction. It's saying of something that it's not what it is, but it's something else. And so the only way you can speak truth is to only speak in tautologies. You can't say the crow is an animal, but you can say the crow is crow, right? And so this seemed like an absurd conclusion to draw for Plato. And so his late dialogues are really a deep dive into how is the judgment S is P even possible without being contradictory in itself. And it's those foundations of thinking judgment that generate the original logical laws that then get developed into the syllogism and all the rest of it, right? So it must be possible to say the crow is an animal without, or Michael is tired. No, Michael's Michael. Michael's not tired, right? So logic cannot be such that that's impossible to say anything true in language that isn't a tautology. And so, yes, this is exactly what's going on, thinking about how, since all thought that can be true or false can only be expressed in the form of judgment, there must be a way of understanding judgment that doesn't condemn it to being mere contradiction all the time. Okay, thanks for your patience. I got Clark and Greg.
Yeah, I like that, Michael, and also Tyler. That was and Philippe. I've actually worked for the Horse Whisperer, the actual dude. Tuned his piano back in California in San Ynez Valley, and yeah, it's not a mystery, but anyway. I like it as an example that you gave. I mean, the idea of a plane flying, and there's no way we can really remember. A helicopter cannot be explained until fairly recently, from what I understand.
I mean, I just want to say, you know, agricultural techniques were developed in the context of religious interpretations of cosmological phenomena, and you can say, well, it worked too, right? It worked, right? So this whole work thing, I think, is completely and utterly vacuous. Understanding being is something completely different than getting something to work, because you can get something to work with ideas that have absolutely nothing to do even with the mechanisms, but we might just get a fortuitous analogy. But that's right. So Philippe, do you want to respond to what Clark and I said before I get to Greg? No? Okay, Greg.
But I guess 2 points if I want to make the second one. Language is inductive, and we keep applying criteria that only, all caps, apply in deductive logic.
Mhm.
And even, if we have to go back to Aristotle, his logical works can be completely every syllogism can be translated into symbols without any language content, but nothing in the rhetoric can.
Mhm.
And it just seems like applying the wrong category. But I want to
Yeah.
also throw something out to Philippe. I forgot also that you don't have the screen in front of you because I typed the Philip from earlier, but you're just on phone. You don't have the screen. I don't know how I think about this, but like the instrumentalist reply to your pragmatism could be that Newton's theory works really, really, really well, but I know nothing about this, so I'm just quoting. But Einstein's theory is true or truer, and Newton's isn't. How does the pragmatist, who also wants to be a realist, an ontological realist, respond?
Is that a direction to, is that a question for Philippe?
Well,
Okay.
for anyone,
I can
but
try to-
especially him. Yeah.
I can try to respond to that.
Cool.
Okay, so I often have the situation, or had in the past, of being the only mathematician in the room who cared about philosophy, right? A whole bunch of mathematicians who just don't care. And this, if there's one thing I wish philosophers would understand about mathematicians, is they just don't care about the ontology of all
Right.
this. Okay, so basically for most mathematicians, it's at the level of gut feeling. So one mathematician says, well, I kind of feel like I'm connecting to some better ideal realm when I do math, but it's how I feel. And another person says, well, I feel like I'm playing a really complicated, elaborate game. And another person says, I feel like we as a human community are constructing this stuff as we go along. And, blah, blah, blah. So they all kind of have a feeling, but all of them would say, but none of that is the real thing. The real thing is the math. Like,
Mhm.
Does the proof of the fundamental theorem of algebra, pick an example, does it work? Is it a valid proof? Yes. Okay, that's the real thing, and the concepts just don't matter. So I'm kind of trying to stand up for the modernist who would look at Schmitt, might read Schmitt, and say, okay, yeah, you're criticizing the concepts I use, but I just don't care. Like, I just don't care about the underlying concepts. I care, does the proof work? And you can apply that in other like Richard Feynman was notoriously anti-philosophy, right? He felt that the fact that he could make the bomb go boom was evidence that he was connected up to reality, or he wouldn't say being, but we can, and that's just all there is. And if you come at Richard Feynman with a lot of concepts, he gets very rude. I knew philosophers who did this, and he would get very rude and dismissive and said, yep, yeah, look, I can make the thing go boom. That is the only real argument for whether or not I'm connected to reality or not.
Yeah, but obviously he's using reality in a very limited and provincial and probably equivocal way, which is what the way scientists tend to use this word, because it doesn't have a scientific definition. And part of the point of dialectic is to get at the reality of what it is that you're trying to talk about. And like we saw in. So it's a different task, and I think your point is exactly right. Scientists just don't have to care about what's real. All they have to care about is what works, and there is no possible inference that is valid from what works to what's real. And so this whole scientism project logically collapses, even though there is an affective and a political and an anti-religious set of reasons why one continues to try to make it as coherent as possible and as true in that sense as possible. But it just gets to the sense that the Greeks are doing something completely different that's completely orthogonal to science and doesn't interfere with the way we do science at all. But it has a lot to do with how we think about science and how we think about what goes beyond science, namely, for instance, its own method. There's no science that comes up with methods of science. It's the understanding of the logic of knowledge that is concretized in a scientific method that allows science to get off the ground at all. And so it's always hanging from these anchors that it can't get into focus and it tends to deny. And we Greek thinkers, we want to talk about it. And okay, Clark.
Yeah, I think, you know, science does not get involved in anything but what works. And there's a reason for that. And I would love to bring that in and have an understanding of what that reason is better. But there was a sense of getting burned by people representing truth from thought in the way that it would happen. And I think if we had a better understanding of that, we'd actually do better with science, because we'd understand that we could accept science as what it is. It's not a replacement for the work that's been done here as far as you know, thinking of itself. But it's a set of cultural mechanisms that has a real important place, and it's there for a reason, and it's very fragile, and it's mostly misunderstood. I mean, the whole popular conceptions of science, you know, having anything to do with truth or having anything to do with what is real, that's a complete misreading of what science is.
I'd like to. I'm trying to articulate a view that I myself don't share, but that I believe that the majority of working scientists do share. So, and I think it's subtly different from what people here are saying. Like, I think that many working scientists, Feynman for sure, would say all of that philosophy stuff, just throw it out the window. So obviously here, you know, we've left what I agree with, but Feynman would say we can throw out all of the philosophy, and you know, he would say people in this room have articulated the idea that science just gets things right and doesn't give you underlying reality. Feynman would say, no, I disagree with that. Science does give you something like a sense of underlying reality, but it can't be articulated in a philosophical way. So it's not a form of instrumentalism. Like Feynman wasn't an instrumentalist. Einstein was very far from an instrumentalist. Like, I mean, but Feynman's view was perhaps more instrumentalist than some. Like, Feynman had the idea that science never gives you a worldview. Okay, so Einstein obviously did. Einstein thought science gave you a worldview. But Feynman said, no, science never gives you a worldview. What science is you take on one problem, you solve it, and you move on. You take on another problem, you solve it, and you move on. And at no point does all of that problem solving add up to a worldview. But nevertheless, Feynman would insist that what science is doing is the best connection to reality we have. And if somebody points out, okay, but you can't articulate that connection to reality, all you can do is give me technology or inputs and output, Feynman would say, fine, I don't care if you can articulate it. That's the best you're ever going to get.
Yeah, but but it's obviously inadequate, right? I mean, insisting is not proving or showing or whatever, right? And so it might just be a subjective peculiarity of the man. I'm saying that would be a perfectly fine inference to make from this kind of, I know there's a reality and we're getting to it, but I don't know what it is, and I don't know how close we are to it, and all the rest of it. I mean, this is wishful thinking.
Again, it's not a view I share. I'm trying to articulate, I think, a respectable view that I don't share.
No,
and
understood.
What I'm finding interesting about Schmidt so far is he hasn't said anything that would make not just Feynman, but I would say, like, I'm hesitant to say this, but I'll just go ahead and say it. Almost all working scientists. Like, Schmidt hasn't said anything so far that would make almost all working scientists question their project.
Well, but that's their blindness, because what Schmidt's getting at is precisely what Feynman would have to begin doing to think about this concept of reality that he's invoking and insisting on but doesn't understand. How would he begin to unpack and explore that? Because by his own admission, physics doesn't do it. Right. And so if the physicist insists on being blind on their own reflective capacity to think about what their science represents, that's just sheer professional stubbornness. And maybe that's part of maybe being professionally stubborn is just part of their worldview. I've read an interesting book that being stubborn and blind to a lot of things is one of the reasons why science is so effective. But I just want to say, I just want to argue for this space, right? That when we go from the laws of physics to talking about reality or talking about truth or talking about things like this, right? We make this logical leap. And my point that I don't think Feynman gets is there is a logic called dialectic and not formal logic that is the proper tool of inquiry into this higher level, what should we call it? This higher level set of predicates like truth and real and good and stuff like that. And I think that Schmidt is precisely giving us the Greek tools for making that difference explicit and for showing us how to negotiate or how to manage thinking in the purely noetic realm of truth and reality and all the rest of these things. And function, we've gotten to function and unity and being and all of these things, right? These aren't just figments of the imagination. There's a reason why even scientists that abstract from all of them, nevertheless come back to them all the time, but not in a scientific way, in a personal way. And the philosopher says, personal is not good enough here, folks. So that's my response. Okay, yeah, and I don't know what you think about that, Philip. I'm interested, but I think you're right. That I think you articulated very well a very predominant worldview. Where you and I disagree, maybe, is you called it respectable, and I wouldn't award it that predicate.
Yeah. Okay.
Cool.
Well, this is a bottomless pit. I could go on for years or days or hours or something. So, it's just, I gotta say, like, I don't think the conversation ends at this point, but I'm impressed by the fact that the airplane stays in the air. And I'm impressed by the fact that the horse whisperer can, change the behavior of the horse. And,
Right.
and the fact that they can't articulate, deep philosophical reasons for this, I'm willing to cut them some slack on this. I'm impressed. Like, I'm impressed that the airplane stays in the air. And I feel like that, like the person who can make the airplane stay in the air arguably has more connection to being, more inarticulable understanding of being than the person whose airplane doesn't stay in the air.
Well, maybe they just don't have a command of the techniques. I think this is very, very interesting because it gets back to the very beginning of philosophy, right? Every Platonic dialogue, Socrates seeks out the expert and says, basically, so what do you understand by this thing you're an expert in? And the experts, when they're not doing their thing, that like being a general or being a politician or being a shoemaker, right? When they're not doing that, they sputter and flail and go from one contradiction to another because their expertise and the reflection on the conditions of the possibility of that expertise are two completely different things. So I would never ask a horse whisperer, what are the conditions of possibility of being a horse whisperer? They'll be like, I do this and it works. And the same for the person building airplanes. What are the conditions of the possibility of this kind of knowledge? I don't know. And we'll move on. But he'll make much better airplanes than I will.
Can I
this just goes
something in?
Yeah, go ahead.
So we've got these different disciplines. We've got experts in those disciplines. And then we've got the disciplines' relation to each other.
Yeah.
And so to use the tool analogy, someone from one discipline may be very confident in their tools, which allow them to succeed there, take them somewhere else, and find they do a ton of damage. So that's one possibility. And so it's important to understand the limitations of the tools and the relation of disciplines to each other. And so an expert in one discipline is not necessarily going to be an expert in disciplines in general. And another problem with that is, so in order to successfully make things work in one discipline, a lot of the time, all you have to do is a ton of trial and error. And so the results of a ton of trial and error in one discipline right? You could take that person, put them in another where they haven't done that trial and error, and they're definitely not going to be able to produce the same impressive results until they, of course, go through a ton of trial and error again.
Interesting. Awesome. Clark, you got your hand up for a while.
Yeah, just so I'm really intrigued by all this. Really appreciate us having this opportunity. So if am I being asked to measure the worth of, if I need the product of a horse whisperer and I need a plane that flies and doesn't crash, isn't it a false equivalence to say, yeah, but you don't understand being? Those are two separate things. They don't, how do they relate?
Right.
What is the account philosophy has for itself, in other words, in respect to the account of someone saying, I'm flying this darn plane and I have no idea? What actual claim does philosophy have in respect to that person? Like if Aristotle interviewed all these experts and he goes, yeah, you can't really talk about what you do. Well, that's my reason for doing the philosophy I'm doing, you know. I have some question about the validity. There's some sort of false equivalence going on that philosophy itself is not made clear, it seems to me. You know, you can talk about, well, they don't know what being is. They don't know what the being of the plane or the air that it's flying in or you in it. And I'm saying, but human beings they want to fly. They want to go places and do things. What account does fly? Actually not, I don't know. That's my question.
I could take this one if.
Oh yeah, Tyler, and then Philippe.
So I think one of the things philosophy can say is there's particular beings, and there's the science of being. And being, it has a more, it's universal in that way. It's what accounts for relations of particular beings to each other. And going back to the different domains or sciences, right? In order to understand the relation to each other, you need the more general understanding. I think and this is loosely and by analogy. This is not a completely adequate response at the, but a science of particular kinds of beings and how to get them to do particular kinds of things is not a science of being in general. And it's also not going to provide you with something that universalizes to other disciplines or domains. So it's not, I don't want to say that there's no knowledge whatsoever going on there, because even in rudimentary determinations of how to, I shouldn't say rudimentary, but if you've got an account of how planes fly, and then you've made a plane fly, there may be some knowledge going on there, but it's not necessarily a complete account of all that goes into the plane flying.
But my question, Tyler, would be, why do we need a complete account? What is your account of why that's necessary?
So it's not necessary if your only goal is to make the plane fly. However, in order to understand the being or perhaps non-being of a plane, you do need a more complete account. So in order for you to speak of particular beings in a way that accounts for them being one and not many, or being a one of many that relates to itself as a system, you have to be able to make certain kinds of distinctions that are completely unrelated to whether or not it happens to work the way you want it to.
And why would you have to make those distinctions? Why do you need to? What is the reason there? The plane is flying.
So if you want to understand why the plane flies, right, that's simply a different project. And the understanding of why something is working the way it is and getting it to work are not the same. No. Understanding why it works, however, may have broader applications, but that's that's a cheap appeal again to, we can make other things work if we understand why better. Of course, that may be appealing to some people, and that's one reason to pursue the why question. But the philosopher is interested in the why in a more general way, because they're concerned with ends and not means. Usually when we think of things in terms of what can I get out of this? What can I do with this? You're concerned with ends you've already determined. And that's the sort of instrumental way of thinking. The philosopher doesn't assume the ends, and so there's a different project going on there.
Yeah, clearly. Yep. Thank you. But I'd like to hear Philippe too.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm trying to think of my best example here. Now, I know I've said this before, but I want to be really clear. I'm trying to articulate an argument that I don't agree with, basically like for science studies reasons, or I've read an unconscionably large amount of Heidegger and, you know, science studies and all this stuff. So I don't buy the argument of the typical working philosopher, of typical working scientist, but I feel the pull of it. I feel a little tug. And as a philosopher, I'm in my comfort zone when I'm confused and where I see like, oh yeah, all 12 positions have some validity. Okay, so that's sort of my comfort zone. Now, here's my best example. One day, Feynman was on the phone with another physicist. I think it was Freeman Dyson, but don't quote me on that. And Feynman was asking a very Greek question. He was saying, you know, everything else in the universe, you know, things are different from one another. One kangaroo is not identical, absolutely identical to another kangaroo. You know, you pick your example. One pine tree is not identical to another pine tree, but every electron is exactly the same as every other electron. And Feynman said, that's weird. That's weird. How come there's no like distinguishing features? How come, you know, this electron doesn't have like a little bit of a bump here or a little bit of a orbital spin there? How come they're exactly identical? And Feynman had a flash of insight, and he said, maybe there's only one electron and it's zipping back and forth in space and time. And that's why like what we perceive as different electrons are all identical, because maybe there's only one. And obviously, what an exciting thought. And they stayed on the phone apparently for 12 hours, like furiously scribbling out the math and doing the physics. And okay, it doesn't work. So purely for physics reasons, it doesn't work. Now, I feel the tug of this. Now, you know, I've read my Heidegger, I've read my science studies. I get it that these things are complicated, but I feel the pull of that. I felt like they were asking a question about being. You know, like the one and the many, the same and the different, like all of that kind of stuff we associate with the Greeks, right? And I feel the tug of that, and that question was decisively resolved. It was decisively resolved with the methods of physics. And before I throw it over, I got to say, I was once in a meetup, which was a whole bunch of mathematicians and physicists and a few economists and one very new agey person who had stumbled in somehow. And when I gave this example, for months I had to hear about the one electron theory as if it was a viable theory. And I was like pulling my hair out and beating myself over the head and saying, it's not a viable theory. It was an example meant to. So anyway, please, for the love of God, nobody conclude that this is a viable theory, however beautiful it is. Okay, I'll stop there.
Awesome. I think, Greg, you're up.
My enthusiasm for the controversy, philosophically, it's interesting, but being a scientist is a full-time job. Being a philosopher is a full-time job. It's hard to do both, and it feels like the apple is criticizing the orange for not having read Heidegger, but the orange, you know, has had much more calculus than the apple, and that bothers me a little bit. But there is a real criticism that does concern me: what people call it the scientism, that modern people are inclined to think that the scientific worldview is all the worldview with a capital T, capital W. That criticism seems totally valid for the apple to tell the orange that it's not every fruit in the world. And sometimes it seems like we go back and forth, that we're criticizing scientists for not being philosophers, but also the more arrogant philosophers criticizing, well, I guess that's the arrogant part. When there's the important criticism, and I know this is, what hopefully Schmidt is focusing on, the real concern is somehow being able to break through the scientism, the view that science is exhaust all of being, without criticizing scientists for being scientists.
Right.
Nicely said, Greg. That was beautiful.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think that's exactly the point. And I think we've been making this point over and over and over again, but somehow we keep coming back to it, that philosophy and science are two different projects. And so philosophy is not a danger or a threat to science. But to the extent to which science wants to pontificate about truth and reality, science is indeed a threat to the kind of thinking that philosophy is. And so we can't establish the boundaries between philosophy and science by scientific means, because the boundary between science and philosophy is not an empirical object. So we must go to philosophy, we must go to reflection, we must go to logic, in order to determine what the boundary is, such that the two discourses don't interfere with one another. And that's, and philosophy is always this higher order thing. It doesn't mean it can tell science how to do science, but all boundaries between any discipline are not the object of study of that discipline, or either one of those disciplines. Right? It's a higher order discrimination, and the extent to which it's justified and the extent to which it's real is again a philosophical question, and we can't go to the sciences for this, because they'll just tell us, yeah, we don't bother, we physicists, we don't fuck with the sociologists, methodically it doesn't work, whatever that, and so they'll just tell you what they do, but they don't tell you why it is that they do it. Why are these methods incompatible? Why is the object domain incommensurable? Right? And so we need to start thinking about higher order object domains and what makes them incommensurable. And then we're at this insuperable reflective level that philosophy ideally tries to occupy and clarify precisely these kinds of distinctions that are determinative of science, but are not philosophy, but science itself doesn't determine them, or has no control over them. It's just, it delimits their field. Anyway, yeah.
Philippe has his hand up.
Philippe. And then
Okay.
Tyler. And then
So,
I'm
like
out.
I said, my usual state as a philosopher is to be pulled in 12 different directions simultaneously, and so all I'm suggesting is that example of like trying to figure out if maybe or exploring the idea that maybe there's only one electron. I'm just curious how people feel about that particular example. Like, because I would think most philosophers would feel a little bit of a tug there, that maybe that was a question with some philosophical relevance. I mean, if it had turned out the other way and there only was one electron and it was zipping back and forth in space and time, that feels a little bit philosophical to me. Like I'm not quite sure I can buy this hard distinction. Like I read Aristotle just a little bit differently, knowing that the Earth is not the center of the universe, or thinking I know it, just a little. Like it doesn't like there's plenty in Aristotle that's there, but and I have a personal rule that anybody who in an argument who mentions Hitler or quantum mechanics or Gödel's proof instantly loses the debate. But so here it goes. I got to mention Gödel's proof. Gödel and many other people believed that Gödel's proof had philosophical implications, that it was an argument for conceptual realism, that it was an argument for thinking that mathematical objects were in some sense real. That's a raging debate, of course, but just the fact that a mathematical proof could have implications for ontology, is interesting. Like I'm not quite so sure we can make this hard distinction, but sadly I've already lost the argument because I mentioned Gödel's proof. So I'll stop there. Yeah, Hitler, quantum mechanics, and Gödel's proof. Instantly, you lose the argument. That's my personal rule.
Yeah, and ontology is said in many ways too, and we just have to keep this, clear. Ontology in the 20th century, especially in Anglo-American thought, was literally, what kinds of objects must we assume in order for the theories of science and mathematics that are successful would have something to talk about, right? That they're not completely vacuous. So ontology becomes derivable from the best theories in mathematics or the successful theories in physics, and so ontology becomes a derivative, and that's Quine's contribution, and it's been very, very powerful force in 20th century philosophy. But that is not the kind of ontology that Aristotle or any Greek would countenance, or at least they would say that's fine. That's not my project. I got something else going. So I just want to say, all of these words, they have they tend to have different senses, and indeed many of the senses changed radically in and through modernity. And so looking at that is actually a really good way of beginning to understand, were the reasons good for the shifts in meaning of these fundamental terms? And sometimes we'll say yes, and sometimes we'll say no, but we need to know what the reasons are in order to make that assessment. So
I guess what I'm worried about here is that if we make too sharp a distinction between Aristotelian metaphysics and other modes of inquiry, I'm worried we're going to end up talking about Aristotle like he's some sort of Heideggerian regional ontology.
yeah.
Do I need to say what a regional ontology is in Heidegger, or can I go on?
If you keep it short, it wouldn't hurt to keep everybody.
Okay, yeah, because different people have different ways of talking about Heidegger. Okay, so one thing about Heidegger is now I'm of the school of thought that Dasein does not refer to an individual. It's human reality in general. It's anything to do with the human. But okay, I'll just use like okay. But so let's say you are doing carpentry. Okay, so a certain ontology, for Heidegger, a certain ontology will show up, like the piece of wood is going to now be disclosed or will show up as a support strut, or or a table leg, or something like that. Whereas, if you're attempting to wine and dine the person you love, a different regional ontology shows up, right? So the wine is now no longer just a beverage; it's some sort of expression of your love if you picked a good wine. Okay, so for Heidegger, like whatever situation Dasein finds itself in, a certain regional ontology is going to show up. And so, yeah, so science is doing something and a certain regional ontology shows up for them. You're attempting to wine and dine the person you love, a different regional ontology shows up. Okay, so what I don't want Aristotle to end up being is just another regional ontology. So he's in a certain situation doing philosophy and he's asking certain questions, and lo and behold, a regional ontology shows up. I just don't think that that's Aristotle, and I think we have to be worried that if we make too much of a distinction between the regional ontology of science and what might be called the regional ontology in that context, but not in the correct context of Aristotle, we're going to end up with a problem, and I don't want that to happen.
Oh, I love that, Philly. We don't want Aristotle to be just another fashionable little philosophical slice to analyze and throw on the table along with the others. That's well said.
Yeah. And I don't mean to suggest that regional ontology thinking in Heidegger isn't profound. I think it is. I just don't think it's Aristotle's kind of profundity.
Right. So, I mean, right. Yeah, no, we should not think Aristotle that way. I totally agree. I'm going to get another hand, and then maybe in the coming weeks. Tyler, but maybe in the coming weeks when we hit gamma, metaphysics gamma, we'll be talking about what a science of being qua being is, and Aristotle will show why the logically prior cannot be derived from the logically posterior, which is precisely what Quine and contemporary ontology does. And so we need to, and if we're really interested in this question, we would either, take the Aristotelian line and saying, well, what they're doing is actually not ontology. It's just projecting certain, it's just hypostasizing certain scientific results and calling them basic reality. Or whether there's a cogent thought of the relationship between the universal and the particular and the logically prior and the logically posterior within the Quinean ambit or his, other positivists that can put some resistance to Aristotle's thinking on this. So I mean, there is something. So there is something to explore, but from the Aristotelian point of view, there is no possibility of thinking him as a regional ontologist, because he would show that it's completely ass backwards to think of something logically prior as dependent on something logically posterior. I mean, that is literally that's just literally absurd. So what we have today is maybe just an absurd use of language, but one that has that we've become habituated to, and so we don't think about it very much. Just that the Aristotelian ontology seems spooky, and so we don't want anything to do with it. But science, that seems really tangible, and so if we're going to talk about ontology at all, we're just going to project this realm of possible objects from what that science needs its universe to be populated with, so that it has something to talk about. So yeah, but Tyler.
One thing I wanted to address about the electron actually is that often disciplines pay attention to ways of being that are relevant to their discipline and ignores others. So when we're considering whether something is the same, often I think the inclination of someone that's focused on a particular discipline with a particular methodology is to attend to the respects their discipline focuses on. And so it can seem like something is the same in all respects when it is merely the same in the respects relevant to their discipline, but not other respects that they haven't accounted for.
Mm-hmm.
So my understanding of what Feynman is doing there is something like that. So he thinks this electron is the same in all respects, and so he thinks there must be only one electron. And I think that there's a good start there with the one, but then he just completely goes out of there and makes the electron move around, which means the electron would have to be able to participate in location, but have different locations.
Mm. Yeah, interesting.
And so it
But
cannot
it was just
always be the same in all
super
respects.
fast. The super fast helps, get rid of that problem. Hey, guys, if somebody has something super profound they want to say, I'm going to continue recording. But if you're not prepared to say something really profound, I'm going to stop recording.
I have something very shallow to say.
Okay.